They laughed at the veteran's strange barn cabin until the night they were begging at his door to stay alive. When a wounded veteran and his loyal canine built a bizarre shelter on Bitterroot Ridge, the whole town mocked them, calling it madness, calling it useless. But when the deadliest blizzard in decades swallowed every home but theirs, the same people who laughed came crawling through the storm, praying for a chance to survive. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The road into Bitterroot Ridge curled like a scar through the mountains, narrow and cracked, the kind of road that made most folks turn around. But Caleb Hunter kept driving. His truck groaned beneath the weight of everything he owned. 3 duffel bags, a toolbox, a rolled American flag, and a single worn-out dog bed that Shadow refused to part with. The German Shepherd sat upright in the passenger seat, ears forward, alert as if they were rolling into a combat zone instead of the place Caleb used to call home. The sky hung low over Montana, a dull sheet of silver that pressed against the peaks and cast long shadows over the valley. Caleb's hands tightened around the steering wheel. His knuckles were white. His breath was shallow. The winter air seeped through a crack in the window and chilled his spine. But the cold wasn't what made him shiver. Flash, dust exploding, bodies falling, the sound of metal tearing into earth. Caleb blinked hard, forcing the memory back into the dark corner where he kept all the others. Shadow leaned closer and nudged his arm, a soft reminder that he wasn't alone. Caleb exhaled, long and shaky. "I'm fine, boy," he whispered, though he didn't believe it. They crested the final ridge and the land opened wide beneath them. The Hunter property lay at the bottom of a long slope. 30 acres of stubborn earth, scattered pine, and a weather-beaten cabin that had belonged to Caleb's father. It looked smaller than he remembered, like time had carved pieces off it and scattered them into the wind. Smoke no longer curled from the chimney. The porch sagged. The windows stared blank and hollow at the winter sky. Shadow's tail thumped once against the seat. Caleb followed the dog's gaze across the valley. Where Caleb saw decay, Shadow saw space to run, sense to discover, a whole world not yet touched by his paws. The dog's quiet eagerness hit Caleb harder than he expected. "You really think this is home, don't you?" he murmured. Shadow looked up at him with that same steady stare that had anchored Caleb in the worst days overseas, when an IED had gone off 12 feet from them, when smoke filled the air and screams echoed off cracked walls, when Shadow had dragged him out of the dust with a determination no human could match. Caleb killed the engine. Silence fell heavy over them. Bitterroot Ridge was too quiet, not a peaceful quiet, but the kind that magnified your own heartbeat until you could hear every uneven rhythm. He stepped out of the truck and scanned the tree line. His training never left him. He felt exposed, watched, though he knew no one was there. Shadow leapt down beside him and pressed against his leg, grounding him the same way he had done on countless patrols. "Just breathe," Caleb muttered, but each breath scraped like sandpaper. He walked toward the cabin slowly, boots crunching over frost-laced grass. The closer he came, the more memories rose. His father chopping wood, the smell of pine sap, the sound of a radio playing old country songs. All of it felt like someone else's life now, a story he had heard once but never lived. Inside the cabin, dust floated through a shaft of gray light. The wooden floor creaked beneath his steps. Shadow sniffed every corner, tail swishing as though reclaiming territory. Caleb set his duffel bags down and lowered himself onto an old wooden chair. It groaned, but held. He rubbed his temples. The silence pressed in again. "This is it," he whispered. "The place I came to fade away." But just as the words left his mouth, Shadow padded over and rested his head on Caleb's knee. The dog's eyes were bright, steady, full of something Caleb wasn't sure he deserved. Hope. The kind that said, "We've survived worse. We can survive this too." Caleb swallowed the knot in his throat. For the first time since stepping onto the property, he looked out the window and saw more than the ghosts of his past. He saw land that could hold a future, if he could ever bring himself to believe in one. The wind outside picked up, rattling the loose boards on the cabin wall. Winter was coming fast. Caleb felt the cold creep into his bones, but Shadow only sat taller, ears pricked, as if whispering, "Not yet. Don't give up yet." And though Caleb didn't answer aloud, something in him, something small and stubborn, answered back. Maybe this wasn't the place he came to die. Maybe, just maybe, it was the place he came to learn how to live again. But Bitterroot Ridge had its own way of testing every soul that dared settle on it. The first snow came early that year, far earlier than any forecast or local gossip had hinted at. One morning, Caleb woke to a sharp cold gnawing at the air inside the cabin, a cold so thin and brittle it felt like it could cut skin. Frost glazed the inside of the windows, and Shadow's breath puffed white clouds into the dim room. Caleb sat up slowly, joints stiff, head pounding with the familiar heaviness that followed a night of broken sleep. He had dreamt in fragments again, boots pounding dirt, a flash of orange, a sound like the sky cracking in half. He woke with Shadow standing on his chest, paws braced, whining softly, as if trying to drag him back to the present. Now, the quiet outside was almost unnatural. Snow blanketed the ridge in a thick white sheen, hiding rocks, roots, and the small footpath leading to the creek. The air tasted metallic, like old pennies and storm breath. "Winter's here," Caleb muttered as he pushed open the door. Shadow trotted out first, tail low, nose sweeping the air. The dog's instincts were sharper than any weather report. Caleb followed, and the cold stabbed through his jacket like knives. His breath froze in the air as he scanned the land. Everything seemed still, as if the world were holding its breath. The woodpile sat 10 yards from the cabin, a tall stack he had built half-heartedly, believing it would be enough. Now it looked pitiful. Snow draped over it like a burial shroud. He walked toward it, grabbing a piece from the top. Wet. Heavy. The moisture had already seeped in. "Damn it," he whispered. Shadow barked, a single sharp warning sound that echoed across the valley. Caleb spun around, heart leaping. But there was nothing. Just the silence pressing back. "It's okay," he said, even though he wasn't sure if it was meant for the dog or himself. By noon, the clouds thickened and the sky dimmed into a bruised gray. A storm was curling in, the kind that came fast and without mercy. Caleb worked quickly, gathering whatever dry wood he could find, checking the cabin's cracks, patching holes with strips of old fabric and nails left behind by his father. Shadow stayed close, pacing, restless. The dog's instincts sharpened the way they used to before a mission. Caleb felt the same pressure tightening his chest. The ridge wasn't a battlefield, but the air carried the same electric charge. When evening settled, the storm hit. Wind slammed against the cabin walls, a deep rolling growl that shook the windows in their frames. Snow burst sideways in sheets. The temperature plummeted so fast, the air inside bit at their skin. Caleb fed the stove until it roared, but the heat slipped away as quickly as he added fuel. Shadows flickered across the room like ghosts, and every pop of the wood sounded like distant gunfire. Flash. Caleb froze. His breath quickened. The wind morphed into the sound of mortar rounds whistling through the air. The cabin walls trembled like the crumbling walls of the outpost in Kandahar. Smoke, thick, choking, flooded his memory. He squeezed his eyes shut. "Not now," he whispered. "Not here." Shadow jumped onto the bed and pressed his body against Caleb's side. The dog nudged his chin, licked his cheek, whined in low, steady pulses meant to ground him. Caleb grabbed fistfuls of Shadow's fur, clinging to the only thing that felt real. The stove crackled. The storm howled. Caleb's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Hours passed in agonizing silence. When the wind finally eased, the cabin had grown icy. Caleb shivered violently, his breath thin. He didn't remember falling asleep. He only remembered a dream where snow smothered him, heavy and relentless. A dream where he couldn't breathe. Then he felt a weight against his chest. Shadow. The dog was standing over him again, pushing his snout against Caleb's face. A soft, desperate whine escaped the dog's throat. Caleb's eyes fluttered open, and his body jolted. He couldn't feel his fingers. His lips were numb. His breath came shallow and ragged. Shadow tugged at the blankets with his teeth, dragging them higher over Caleb's body. The dog circled, lay down tightly against his side, and pushed his warmth into Caleb with frantic determination. Caleb exhaled a shaky breath that fogged in front of his eyes. "Good boy," he whispered, barely audible. Shadow rested his head on Caleb's chest and stayed there until Caleb's breathing steadied again, until color returned to his lips, until the threat of slipping away passed. Long after dawn stretched pale light across the cabin, Caleb lay still, stunned by how close the night had come to taking him. He stared at the frosted ceiling, his breath slow and heavy. "If we stay like this," he murmured, voice hoarse, "we're not gonna make it." Shadow lifted his head, ears tilting forward. Caleb looked toward the woodpile buried under a fresh layer of snow, at the fragile walls of the cabin, at the frost creeping across the window like white cracks in glass. And for the first time since arriving on Bitterroot Ridge, fear didn't come alone. It came with a realization. He needed something better, something stronger, something that could keep him and Shadow alive. Shadow nudged his hand again, as if agreeing. Caleb whispered, "We're building something new, boy. Something that won't let winter kill us." But even as he spoke the words, another truth tightened in his chest. This place wasn't done testing him, and the next test would come sooner than he expected. 3 mornings after the storm, Bitterroot Ridge woke under a pale sun that did little to warm the land. The cold still clawed at the air, but the wind had eased, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt like standing inside a held breath. Caleb stepped outside the cabin, boots crunching through the crust of snow. Shadow trotted ahead, nose low, tail swishing as he scanned the ridge. Caleb's gaze drifted toward the half-buried woodpile. He approached it, brushed off snow, and tugged on a log. Water dripped from the end, soaking into his glove. Useless. He tried another. Soaked. The weight of it told the whole story. The storm hadn't just taken his heat. It had stolen his time. If another snow came, the logs wouldn't dry. Not this season. Maybe not even next. He stood still for a long moment, breath clouding in front of him, mind turning the way it used to before a mission. Slow at first, then sharp. He scanned the land, the slope of the ridge, the angle of the cabin, the pattern of drifting snow. Instincts fell into place like puzzle pieces. He didn't need a bigger cabin. He didn't need a different cabin. He needed a second structure, wrapped around the first, built to shield it, to insulate it, to keep fuel dry and within arm's reach, even in the worst storm. Shadow barked once, looking back as if sensing the gears turning in Caleb's mind. "Yeah," Caleb whispered. "I think I've got it." He dropped to a crouch and used his hand to scrape a large patch of snow away until dark soil peeked through. Then he drew, lines forming a square around the cabin, then another square outside it, creating a channel between the two. He added a steep roof, angled sharp like the mountain peaks. He drew shelves along the inside of the outer walls where cords of wood could sit dry all winter. Shadow circled him, pausing every few seconds to look at the design. Caleb sat back on his heels, a spark igniting in his chest. "A barn cabin," he murmured. "Layered walls, air gap, dry storage, and a roof that sheds snow faster than it can pile." The idea wasn't new, not exactly. He'd seen structures like this overseas, in remote mountain outposts where the cold killed faster than bullets. Double-wall shelters, improvised from whatever materials soldiers could drag through the desert or up the cliffs. They weren't pretty, but they were strong. They saved lives. And what he needed wasn't pretty. It just had to keep him and Shadow alive. Inside the cabin, he rummaged through his father's old tool chest. Rusted nails, a dull hatchet, a handsaw with a missing tooth. Tools too worn for fine work, but good enough to start something rough. He grabbed his tape measure, a carpenter's pencil, and the last roll of marking string. Shadow sat by the door, watching with patient interest. As Caleb stepped back outside, he felt something unfamiliar. Something he hadn't felt since before the blast, before the sand, before the night that ended his team's final mission. Purpose. He measured beams, marked the ground with stakes, and stretched string to outline the new structure. Shadow followed each step, sometimes getting tangled in the string, earning a gentle shove and a quiet laugh from Caleb, the first laugh in months. "You're not helping," Caleb said, though his smile stayed. Hours passed. Snow melted on his gloves. The cold crept into his boots, but he barely noticed. The design grew clearer. A protective shell around the cabin, thick enough to trap heat, wide enough for stacked wood, and strong enough to face a Montana winter head-on. By noon, the sun broke through the clouds, spilling a muted gold over the ridge. Caleb wiped sweat and frost from his brow and stepped back to admire the crude outline. Shadow sat beside him, tail sweeping the snow. "What do you think?" Caleb asked. Shadow nudged the nearest stake with his nose. "I'll take that as approval." But as the light faded and cold seeped in again, doubts settled like frost on Caleb's heart. He stared at the outline, a small army of fears marching through his thoughts. What if it collapses? What if I can't finish before winter hits harder? What if my head isn't right enough to get this done? A sharp gust of wind rattled the cabin walls behind him. The sound cracked through the air like distant thunder. Flash, a wall collapsing, soldiers shouting, dust raining down, Shadow dragging him by his vest, teeth clenched tight. Caleb's breath hitched. He closed his eyes and gripped his knees until his pulse steadied. The ridge around him faded back into view, calm and indifferent. Shadow pressed against his leg. "Yeah, I know," Caleb whispered, "one thing at a time." He forced himself to stand tall again. He would build this thing. He had to. For the first time since returning home, he wasn't just reacting to the ridge. He had a plan. Something solid. Something real. Something that could change everything. Shadow barked once. Short, sharp, confident. Caleb looked down at him. "Tomorrow we start. Every hour we've got, before the next storm finds us." The wind stirred, carrying the faint sound of pine trees brushing together. The ridge did not welcome him. It didn't reject him either. It simply waited. And standing beside the outline of his future shelter, with Shadow at his side, Caleb felt a flicker of something he hadn't let himself feel in a long, long time. Hope. Quiet, stubborn, and warm enough to push back the cold. That hope didn't last long. By the end of the week, word had spread down the mountain that the hunter boy was building something strange on his father's land. In small towns like Mill Creek, news carried faster than wind, especially when it involved a man who had left years ago and returned with scars no one could see. Caleb first noticed the watchers when he was cutting timber near the slope behind his cabin. The swing of his axe echoed through the cold morning air, each strike sending vibrations through his arms and ribs. Shadow paced nearby, ears twitching. When Caleb paused to catch his breath, he sensed it too, the feeling of eyes on him. Two men stood at the crest of the ridge road, hands shoved into their coat pockets, breath fogging the air. They weren't trying to hide. They were staring openly at the stakes and string marking the outer walls of his barn cabin. Caleb lifted a hand in greeting. The men didn't wave back. By the time he hauled the first beams into place 2 mornings later, he'd grown used to the watchers. Men, women, even a few teenagers wandered up the road, pausing long enough to squint at his construction, whisper something to each other, and laugh as they walked away. The worst of them all arrived on horseback. Earl Thompson rode like the land belonged to him, which, in his mind, it nearly did. The man owned one of the largest ranches stretching along the lower valley, and his voice carried farther than his sense. Thick jacket, trimmed beard, hat tilted back just enough to reveal the smirk permanently etched into his face. He reined in his horse at the fence line, peering down at Caleb with a mix of amusement and suspicion. "Well, I'll be damned," Earl said loudly, "if it ain't the great Caleb Hunter himself. Thought you were still hiding out somewhere warm." Caleb kept his focus on setting the beam into its notch. "Morning, Earl." Shadow moved between them, standing alert, tail stiff. Earl chuckled. "Building a... what exactly?" He waved his hand in a circle. "Looks like a cowshed mated with a panic bunker." Caleb steadied the beam. "Just a winter shelter." "For what? The end of days?" Earl turned in his saddle so the 2 farmhands behind him could hear. "Maybe that PTSD knocked him clean into crazy." The farmhands snorted. Shadow growled low, not loud enough to provoke, but loud enough to warn. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Please keep your distance. I'm working here." "Oh, don't mind us." Earl leaned forward in his saddle. "Just checking on my neighbor. Folks in town say you're building some kind of war bunker. Figured I'd see it myself." Shadow stepped closer to Caleb, hackles rising. "Shadow," Caleb muttered, calming the dog with a hand to his shoulder. "Easy, boy." Earl smirked at the display. "See? Even your mutt thinks you're losing it." Caleb didn't rise to the bait. Years in the service had taught him which fights mattered, and Earl Thompson wasn't a battle worth bleeding for. Still, Earl wasn't done. "You know, Caleb, some of us are wondering if that structure is even safe. Last thing the ridge needs is some ex-soldier blowing up half the mountain because he wired something wrong." "I'm not wiring anything." Caleb's voice stayed calm, though the cold in his gut sharpened. "And it's not your concern." "Ah," Earl said, turning his horse. "That's where you're wrong. Everything up here becomes my concern sooner or later." Caleb watched him ride off, breath tight in his chest. The wind carried Earl's laughter long after the horses disappeared behind the pines. That evening, Caleb walked into Mill Creek for supplies. Nails, rope, more canvas. The bell over the door of Tully's general store jingled as he entered. The warmth hit him first, then the smell of coffee and wood polish. People inside turned to look, and they didn't stop looking. Megan Tully, the owner, leaned on the counter with a too bright smile. "Well, if it isn't Caleb Hunter, heard you're building something interesting." He kept his voice neutral. "Just fixing the place up." "Oh, honey, that ain't what I heard." She tapped her ear. "Folks say you're building a fort, or a bunker, or a giant doghouse. The stories are wild." A group of teenagers by the canned goods aisle burst into laughter. Caleb forced a tight smile. "People can say what they want." "Oh, and they do," Megan replied, leaning in. "Some think you're preparing for another war. Some think you're digging into the mountain for gold. And some think you've finally lost it." Her words weren't cruel, but they stung all the same. He paid for his supplies and left quickly, Shadow padding close, sensing Caleb's unease. By the time he returned to the ridge, a letter was pinned to his cabin door. The seal belonged to the Mill Creek Township Council. Caleb tore it open with numb fingers. A formal warning. His unapproved structure might violate local building safety standards. They demanded he cease construction until an inspection could be arranged. Shadow leaned into his side, offering silent support. Caleb stared at the paper, wind whipping around him. He felt the ground shift under his feet. Not literally, but inside, where old fears mixed with new anger. "They don't understand," he whispered. "They don't see what this ridge can do." Shadow pressed his head against Caleb's hip. Caleb folded the letter, shoved it into his coat pocket, and looked at the skeletal outline of his shelter. The town could laugh. Earl could sneer. The council could threaten. None of them had stood in a freezing cabin gasping for breath while death hovered inches away. None of them understood that he wasn't building a symbol of fear. He was building a chance at survival. The wind rose, carrying snow across the ridge like white smoke. Caleb squared his shoulders. "Come on, Shadow," he said quietly. "We keep building." And together, they walked into the cold, into the ridicule, into the uncertainty, determined to finish what they'd started. In the days that followed, the rhythm of Caleb's life settled into a lonely, stubborn push forward. He woke before the sun, brewed coffee on the old iron stove, and stepped outside into air so cold it stung his lungs. The mountain ridge rarely spoke, but when it did, it spoke through the wind, low and hollow, threading through the pines like a warning. Caleb worked anyway. He cut lumber, hauled beams, set posts, and reinforced the ground with rocks he dug from the frozen soil. Every strike of his hammer echoed through the valley, a steady heartbeat against the winter silence. Shadow stayed beside him, ever watchful. Sometimes the dog carried small pieces of wood in his mouth, as if trying to help. Other times he simply sat and scanned the tree line, guarding Caleb from dangers seen and unseen. The watchers kept coming. Strangers paused on the ridge road. Some shook their heads. Some laughed outright. A few snapped pictures on their phones, as if Caleb and Shadow were part of some backwoods roadside attraction. But on a crisp afternoon, when the sun dipped low and painted the snow in amber hues, a different figure approached. A soft voice carried across the clearing. "Hello? Caleb Hunter?" Caleb lowered the beam he was moving and straightened slowly. The woman walking toward him wore a maroon winter coat, a wool hat pulled low over her ears, and mittens with hand-stitched patterns. She looked out of place in the harsh landscape, not fragile but warm, like someone who belonged in a library rather than a frozen mountaintop. Shadow trotted forward first, not aggressively, curiously. His tail wagged once, slow and deliberate, a sign of respect. The woman stopped a few feet away, her breath forming small clouds. "I'm Lydia Moore. I teach history down in Mill Creek." Caleb nodded politely. "Afternoon. I hope I'm not interrupting." She glanced at the half-built structure behind him. "I was hiking up the trail and, well, I'll be honest. I've heard people talking about what you're building out here. None of them could explain it properly, so I figured I should just ask you myself." There was no mockery in her tone, no sharp edge hidden beneath a smile, just genuine curiosity. Caleb exhaled, tension easing from his shoulders. "It's a winter shelter. A barn cabin, sort of. I'm building an outer shell around the cabin to store wood and trap heat." Lydia stepped closer, her boots crunching softly in the snow. "Like a double-walled structure?" "Exactly." Caleb pointed to the stakes outlining the gap. "The air pocket between the walls insulates the cabin, and with wood stored under the same roof, snow can't bury it again." Lydia's eyes brightened, reflecting the faint gleam of the setting sun. "That's brilliant. Truly." Caleb blinked. "You're the first person to say that. Then the others aren't paying attention." She smiled gently. My dad used to say folks fear what they don't understand. Doesn't make them right. Shadow nudged her hand, and she laughed softly. Well, you're friendly, she said, scratching behind his ears. At least one of the hunters approves of me. Caleb felt a strange warmth in his chest. Unexpected, almost forgotten. He doesn't take to strangers easily, he admitted. Dogs know, Lydia said simply. They always know. For a moment the mountain quieted, leaving only the distant whisper of wind through the pines. Lydia studied the structure thoughtfully. Caleb, she said, voice gentle but steady. You're not building fear. You're building safety. That matters, especially up here. Her words hit something deep inside him, something hollow yet waiting to be filled. Caleb cleared his throat, unsure what to say. She glanced at her watch. I should head down before it gets dark, but would you mind if I came back to see the progress? I'm fascinated by this kind of design. Caleb surprised himself when he answered, Sure, anytime. Lydia nodded, gave Shadow one last pat, and started toward the trail. Just so you know, she called over her shoulder, Mill Creek has more than its share of loud opinions, but some of us still know how to listen. Caleb watched her disappear into the tree line, her footprints soft against the snow. For a long moment, he stood still, letting the quiet settle around him again. But it wasn't the same quiet as before. Something had shifted. A small crack had opened in the heavy wall he'd built around himself since returning home. Shadow brushed against his leg, tail lifting. Yeah, Caleb murmured. She's different. He faced the barn cabin structure once more. The beams looked straighter somehow. The walls felt sturdier. Or maybe it was him, standing taller, breathing steadier, seeing the path ahead with a little more clarity. He picked up his hammer. One person believing in him didn't erase the ridicule of a whole town. But it was enough to keep him building. Enough to remind him why he had started. Enough to make the ridge feel a little less like a place to die. And a little more like a place he might finally learn to live again. But hope, the fragile kind, always seemed to draw storms behind it. Late November brought a stretch of clear sky, the kind of cold brightness that sharpened every sound across Bitterroot Ridge. Caleb used every hour of daylight to push the barn cabin closer to completion. He worked the roof frame next, hauling lumber up a ladder, measuring angles, tightening joints with gloved hands. The steep pitch he'd designed, 45 degrees, would shed snow instead of letting it build. It had to be perfect. Shadow watched from below, lying in a patch of sun, ears flicking every time Caleb shifted his weight. You're supposed to be resting, Caleb called down. Guard duty doesn't include staring at me like I'm gonna fall. Shadow tilted his head, clearly unconvinced. Caleb chuckled softly. He felt almost normal. Almost like the man he'd been before the desert, before the explosion, before the world went silent and wrong. He lifted the next board, set it against the ridge beam, and hammered the first nail. Clang! The sound cracked through the air like a thunderclap, and suddenly he wasn't on the roof anymore. He was back in Kandahar, a night sky torn open by fire, concrete shaking under his boots, someone yelling, "Hunter, get down!" A flash so bright it carved shadows into his bones. Then dust, thick, choking dust, and Shadow, Ranger back then, dragging him by the vest, paws scraping the floor, refusing to let him die. The world roared in his ears, his heart slammed against his ribs, the roof vanished beneath his feet. He slipped. The hammer flew from his hand, clattering across the boards. Caleb's vision blurred, and the sky spun. His boot slid off the edge of the beam. The valley below tilted. Shadow barked, a sharp, frantic sound. Caleb's fingers clawed at the beam, but caught nothing but cold air. Then a weight hit his pant leg. Shadow. The dog had launched himself halfway up the ladder, jaws locking onto Caleb's thick work pants just above the boot. He held fast, muscles straining, paws scrambling for purchase as he bore the full weight of a falling man. "Shadow, hold on!" The dog growled through clenched teeth, refusing to let go. Caleb twisted, got one hand back on the beam, then the other. With a final heave, he swung himself back onto the roof frame. Shadow dropped to the ground, landing hard. He yelped, a short, pained sound that pierced Caleb's chest more sharply than any nightmare. "No, no, no!" Caleb scrambled down the ladder, breath ragged. "Shadow!" The dog limped toward him, tail wagging weakly, as if ashamed of the trouble he'd caused. Caleb knelt, hands shaking as he checked the dog's front leg. Shadow flinched, a tiny movement, but enough. He'd pulled a muscle, maybe worse. Caleb's throat tightened. "You saved my life again," he whispered, running a hand over Shadow's head. "But not like this. You hear me? Not if it hurts you." Shadow nudged his hand, leaning into him as if saying he'd do it 1,000 times over. For a moment, Caleb just held him, forehead pressed to Shadow's warm neck, grounding himself in the dog's steady breathing. The ridge wind blew around them, carrying the scent of pine sap and distant snow. He wasn't falling anymore. He wasn't trapped in the blast. Shadow had pulled him back, like always. He carried the dog inside the cabin and laid him on the old braided rug near the stove. Shadow watched him with soft eyes, alert but tired. Caleb wrapped a warm cloth around the dog's leg, whispering assurances the way he never managed to offer himself. "You're gonna be okay, boy. I promise." Outside, the ridge groaned under the weight of gathering clouds. A new storm was brewing. He could feel it in the air. But inside, the cabin glowed with the faint warmth of the small fire. Caleb sat beside Shadow, one hand resting on his fur, every breath calmer than the last. But the incident had shaken him deeper than he wanted to admit. The roof needed finishing. The frame wasn't secure yet. There was too much to do before true winter arrived. And now Shadow, his partner, his anchor, was hurt because Caleb couldn't keep the past from clawing its way into the present. He stared at his trembling hands. "Get it together," he whispered. Shadow shifted, placing his paw, injured leg and all, onto Caleb's boot. Caleb's breath cracked in his chest. This dog had saved him more times than any human ever had. Outside, wind scraped across the ridge, lifting loose snow into swirling ghosts. Caleb looked toward the unfinished shelter through the frosted window. He was building this place to protect them, to keep the cold out, to keep the past out. But today was the reminder he didn't want. The past could break through walls far easier than winter ever could. Thunder rumbled faintly over the mountains, and Caleb placed a hand on Shadow's back, as if drawing strength from the steady rise and fall of the dog's breath. Tomorrow, he would climb back onto that roof. Tomorrow, he would keep building. Tomorrow, he would make this shelter strong enough for both of them. But tonight, he stayed on the floor beside Shadow, the fire's glow flickering softly across old scars, both seen and unseen, and the ridge whispering its cold promise. Survive, if you can. Morning crept in slowly, gray light pooling across the wooden floorboards. Caleb's back ached from sleeping half-sitting against the stove, but Shadow's breathing was steady. The dog nudged him gently when he stirred, as if saying, "Still here, still fighting." Caleb eased to his feet and fed another log into the stove. Outside, the wind had quieted, replaced by a vast stillness that blanketed Bitterroot Ridge. Snow lay heavy on the pines, bowing their branches like old men leaning on canes. He stepped out into the crisp air. His breath fogged instantly, drifting into the pale dawn. He looked toward the half-finished barn cabin, the structure that had nearly cost him his life. and felt the familiar weight of doubt settle on his shoulders. Before he could take a step toward it, he sensed movement on the road. A figure trudged through the snow, bundled in layers of worn flannel and wool. The man's beard was white, long enough to blend into the fur lining of his coat, and he walked with the unhurried certainty of someone who knew the mountain better than most men knew their own homes. Shadow let out a low, alert bark, not a warning, but a notice. Caleb narrowed his eyes. "Morning," he called cautiously. The old man raised a gloved hand. "You must be Hunter." His voice carried the rumble of gravel and cold whiskey, rough but not unfriendly. Caleb nodded. "And you're—" "Jack Rourke." The man stepped closer, breath puffing in slow clouds. "Most folks call me Old Jack." He surveyed the cabin, then shifted his gaze toward the large frame Caleb had begun constructing. "Heard you're building something up here that's got the whole town buzzing." Caleb folded his arms, not defensive, just guarded. "People sure seem interested." Jack chuckled, a deep sound from somewhere in his chest. "People in Mill Creek got two hobbies: stay warm in winter and judge things they don't understand." Shadow walked up to Jack, sniffed his coat, then pressed his head lightly against the man's leg. Caleb blinked. Shadow wasn't quick to trust. Jack scratched behind the dog's ears. "Good boy. Strong spirit. He's seen things." "Yeah," Caleb said quietly. "So have I." The old man's eyes softened. He didn't pry. Instead, he turned back toward the shelter frame. He examined the angles, the spacing, the heavy beams set into the earth. He circled it slowly, boots crunching with every step. "You build this design yourself?" he asked. "A version of it," Caleb said. "We used double-wall shelters in Afghanistan, outposts in the mountains, built fast, kept the cold out." Jack nodded knowingly. "A life wall." Caleb frowned. "A what?" "That's what we called them in Alaska, back when winters had teeth." Jack tapped one of the beams. 2 layers. Air pocket inside. Air don't move. Heat don't escape. Smart design. Caleb let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "So it'll work?" Jack gave him a sideways glance. "It'll work if you build it right." With surprising agility for a man his age, Jack stepped forward and pointed to the base of the outer wall. "Your gap's good, but you need better footing. Snow will pile and shift. Ground moves under structures out here. You brace this corner with stone and it'll stand longer than you and I both will." Caleb listened, absorbing every word like a thirsty man catching rain. Jack wasn't finished. "And your firewood shelves, good idea keeping them inside the ring. But you'll want drainage trenches around the outside. Snow melts, water flows, wood rots, you freeze." Shadow barked once, as if in agreement. Caleb nodded slowly. "I didn't think about the runoff. That's why I came." Jack shrugged. "Heard the town calling your project crazy. Figured anything they called crazy was worth seeing." Caleb cracked the faintest smile. "And? Still think I'm crazy?" "Oh, no doubt," Jack grinned. "But crazy ain't the same as wrong." He stepped closer, studying Caleb's face. "You're not building fear, son. You're building strategy. There's a difference." Caleb swallowed, caught off guard by how deeply the words landed. "You're the first man up here to understand that." Jack tapped his temple. "Experience teaches, sometimes the hard way." His gaze drifted to Shadow. "And sometimes the loyal way." Shadow moved closer, tail wagging weakly. Jack crouched and examined the dog's leg gently. "Pulled tendon. Could have been worse. Keep him warm. Keep him still for a few days. He'll mend fine." Relief washed through Caleb like a warm current. "Thank you." Jack rose and brushed snow from his coat. "Hunter," he said, "this ridge has teeth. Winter will come down on you like a hammer. You build this shelter right, You'll have the safest place in the valley, but build it wrong." He paused, letting the silence complete the thought. Caleb finished it anyway. "We won't make it." Jack nodded once. "Then don't build it wrong." He turned to leave, but paused halfway up the road. "Oh, and if Thompson or the council gives you trouble, you send for me. I built half the barns in this county before most of them were born." "Why are you helping me?" Caleb asked. Jack looked back, eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. "Because a man trying to survive ain't something I mock, and because that dog of yours," he pointed at Shadow, "knows character better than any politician in Mill Creek." Caleb stood there long after Jack disappeared down the ridge, the cold biting at his cheeks, the sun barely warming the world. But something inside him warmed anyway. For the first time since returning home, another man had looked at him. Not with pity, not with suspicion, not with ridicule, but with respect. Caleb set his jaw, turned toward the shelter, and picked up his tools. With Shadow at his side and old Jack's wisdom in his hands, he felt stronger than he had in years. Winter would come, but he would be ready, or so he believed, until the world beyond his ridge decided otherwise. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of labor. Caleb worked from dawn until the sun tucked itself behind the mountains, pushing his injured shoulder, ignoring the ache in his ribs, and checking on Shadow every hour. The dog was healing, slowly, but still limping. Even so, Shadow refused to rest longer than Caleb did, hobbling after him, determined to be part of every moment. The barn cabin had begun to look like a real structure. Thick outer walls rose waist-high, the beams for the roof ready for placement. The stone-braced corners, Jack's suggestion, were solid and unmoving, even under the shifting frost. Caleb stood back one morning, breath clouding as he admired the progress. For the first time since the nightmares began, he felt like he had a real chance. Then the sound of car engines drifted up the mountain road. Shadow's ears shot up. He growled, a deep rumbling sound that sent a ripple of tension through Caleb's spine. 3 trucks crawled up the ridge, tires crunching through ice. Doors slammed. Voices carried over the cold air. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. Not today. Earl Thompson stepped out first, coat open, hat tipped back, arrogance worn like a second skin. Behind him came Carl Willard, his ranch foreman, and Mitch Brenner, a young local who enjoyed getting attention almost as much as he enjoyed trouble. They looked like a trio marching toward entertainment. Earl stopped in front of the barn cabin frame, hands on his hips. "Well, boys, would you look at that? He's really doing it." Mitch snickered. "Looks like a giant outhouse for lumber." Carl spat into the snow, more like something you see in one of those doomsday shows. Caleb tightened his grip on the hammer. "Morning," Earl smirked. "Morning? Hunter, you've been busy. Almost makes a man wonder if you're preparing for war." Shadow limped forward, standing between Caleb and the men. His eyes locked on Earl like a pin pulled from a grenade. Earl raised his hands mockingly. "Easy, dog. I'm not here to start trouble." Caleb stepped forward, voice low. "Then say what you came to say." "Oh, I'll say it." Earl pointed at the frame. "This thing right here, this monstrosity, is becoming a problem." Caleb's jaw set. "It's on my land." "Doesn't matter." Earl lifted a folded paper from his coat. "The council's meeting tomorrow. I'm bringing a formal complaint. Unsafe structure. Eyesore to the community. Potential fire hazard. You name it." Caleb didn't reach for the paper, just stared. Mitch grinned. "Heard you almost fell off the roof last week. Maybe that dog saved you, but next time." Shadow's growl deepened. Caleb's muscles tensed. The scene flickered, just for an instant. Mitch's taunting voice morphing into shouts from the desert. Earl's stance transforming into an enemy silhouette against blinding sun. He forced the vision away. Earl leaned in, voice smooth and sharp as broken glass. Look, Hunter, we all know what happened to you overseas. No shame in it. But maybe you shouldn't be building things this big. Folks say you're not steady, that you're rattled. Something cold slid through Caleb's veins. People talk because they're afraid of what they don't know. Oh, they know, Earl replied, eyes narrowing. They know you're out here alone with that dog, hammering at all hours, jumping at sounds. He tilted his head. They know you're not right. Shadow lunged forward a step, not enough to attack, but enough to make Earl flinch back. Carl and Mitch stiffened. Earl covered his embarrassment with a laugh. You see that? Even the dog's volatile. Caleb exhaled through his nose, voice steady. Shadow's smarter than all three of you put together, and he knows when someone's causing trouble. Earl's eyes darkened. This isn't over, Hunter. Tomorrow, you're answering to the council. You'll take this thing down. No, Caleb said. I won't. Mitch barked a laugh. You won't have a choice. Earl smirked again. You're a soldier without orders now, Hunter. And without orders, he tapped his temple. Men like you don't do too well. Caleb stepped forward, shoulders squared. Leave. Earl held his stare for a long, icy moment, an unspoken challenge lingering between them. But then he nodded to his men and turned back toward the trucks. You'll see, Hunter, he called over his shoulder. That thing is coming down, one way or another. Their engines roared to life, grinding down the ridge road. Snow billowed behind them, swirling in their wake like stirred ghosts. Caleb didn't move until silence returned to the mountain. Only then did he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the anger he'd been forced to swallow whole. Shadow nudged him gently, pressing his head against Caleb's thigh. Caleb rested his hand on the dog's neck. I know, buddy, he whispered. I know. They'll try to tear this down. They'll try to tear us down. He looked at the incomplete shelter, its beams black against the fading winter sky, its shape still skeletal, but full of promise. But they don't understand what we've already survived. The wind rushed through the pines again, cold, sharp, and almost cruel. Caleb stood tall against it. Tomorrow would bring a fight he didn't want. But tonight he'd build. Not just the shelter, but the resolve to see it finished, no matter who tried to stand in his way. The next morning dawned cold and blue, a hard kind of cold that bit into bone. But Caleb Hunter was already outside before sunrise, breath fogging in the dim light as he lifted the first beam of the day. His muscles ached, the kind of deep ache earned only after weeks of labor, but he didn't slow. Determination had settled over him like armor. Shadow limped beside him, recovering but still refusing to stay inside. Every few minutes the dog glanced toward the ridge, ears twitching as if expecting Earl or someone else to come back. Caleb found comfort in that loyalty, steadfast, watchful, unbroken. As the frost began to thaw under the rising sun, Lydia Moore appeared on the trail again. She waved from a distance. You're out early. Winter doesn't wait, Caleb called back. Shadow bounded toward her with a soft bark, still limping, but excited. Lydia bent to greet him, rubbing behind his ears. He liked. You're looking better, big guy. Caleb felt a warmth he didn't quite understand. Lydia carried something calm within her, something steady. In the storm of ridicule and confrontation, she was an unexpected lighthouse. What happened yesterday? She asked gently. I saw trucks heading up this way. Caleb tightened a bolt on the frame. Earl came by, brought friends, said he's filing a complaint. Lydia's expression darkened. That man has been trouble for years. He doesn't like anything he can't control. Caleb said nothing. He didn't need to. Lydia stepped to his side, studying the structure. "It's impressive," she said. "Really, the town may not see the usefulness yet, but they will." He appreciated her confidence more than he let on. The day pressed forward. Lydia left before the afternoon wind picked up, but her presence lingered in the way Caleb moved. More certain, more grounded. He worked through the cold, through his own aches, through the ghosts that clawed at the back of his mind whenever the hammer struck too hard. By week's end, the outer walls rose taller than his shoulders, thick and packed with stone reinforcements. The gap between the cabin and the outer ring was perfectly measured, a 6-foot walkway where he could store cords and cords of firewood. He began filling it immediately, stacking logs in neat rows, the smell of fresh-cut pine filling the air. Shadow limped in circles around the woodpile, occasionally stealing a stick and carrying it proudly like part of the inventory. Caleb pretended not to notice. On the 10th day of relentless work, the roof went up, a steep, angular canopy of timber layered with canvas, bark, and the first bricks of sod he cut from the ridge. It took 3 days to lay enough sod to cover half of it. By the 4th day, as the last rows were set, the structure finally took on its full shape. It looked nothing like a traditional barn, nothing like a cabin. It was something else, a hybrid of survival and strategy, of memory and design. When he stepped back, breath frosting in front of him, he saw not a strange shape, but a strong one. A quiet fortress wrapped around a fragile center, a place built not from fear, but from experience. Old Jack Rourke hobbled up the trail that afternoon, leaning on his cane. "Well," he said, puffing out a satisfied breath, "I'll be damned. You did it." Caleb smiled, weary but proud. "Not done yet," Jack chuckled. "Looks done enough to survive a war." Caleb's smile faded. The word war always hit him in a place he didn't show. Jack noticed, but didn't press. "You built something fine here," the old man said. "Most folks build homes to keep the cold out. You built one to keep life in." Shadow nudged Jack's hand. The old man scratched the dog's head fondly. "And you, keep this man alive long as you can, hear?" Shadow wagged his tail. As Jack left, the sky darkened into early evening. Caleb lit a lantern inside the barn cabin walkway, the warm glow bouncing across the stacked firewood and rough-hewn walls. For the first time since he returned to Bitterroot Ridge, the cold didn't seep into his bones. The air inside the double-walled structure was still, cocooned from the wind. He stepped through the inner doorway into his cabin. The warmth from the stove held steady. The space felt tighter, but safer now, wrapped in its new shell like a seed encased in protective bark. Shadow curled near the stove, sighing contentedly. Caleb sat on the edge of his bed, sweat drying on his shirt, his hands trembling, but not from fear, from relief. It was finished. The barn cabin, his life wall, his shield, his second chance, stood complete before winter's wrath could arrive. He looked around the dim cabin, hearing the wind scrape along the outer roof but not penetrate deeper. For the first time since coming home, he felt something that had gone missing for years. Security. But even as he savored the moment, another whisper of wind curled around the ridge, colder than before. Caleb felt it in his bones, the way a hunter senses a storm long before the first clouds gather. Shadow lifted his head too, ears pricking toward the north. A storm was coming, one far worse than the last. The barn cabin was ready, but he had no idea how much the town, and his own fate, would soon depend on it. The first warning came as a whisper on the radio. Caleb had turned it on only because the ridge felt wrong that morning. Too still, too bright, too sharp around the edges. A local forecaster spoke in an uneasy tone, mentioning air patterns shifting across Canada, dropping lower, faster, colder than expected. By noon, that whisper had become a warning. By dusk, it became a threat. A whiteout storm, the kind old-timers told stories about, was forming on the northern plains, gathering momentum like a beast waking from a long sleep. Caleb stepped outside, Shadow at his side. The air smelled metallic again, the same scent he remembered from the storm that nearly killed him weeks earlier. Snow clouds built on the horizon like walls of smoke. Bitterroot Ridge stood in eerie silence. Shadow's posture changed. The dog stiffened, nose high, tail rigid. "You smell it too," Caleb murmured. The dog didn't bark. He didn't need to. The storm was coming. Caleb moved quickly. He checked the roof seams, reinforced the inner door, stacked the driest firewood closest to the cabin wall, and shoveled a final path between the barn cabin ring and the cabin door. The barn cabin felt different now, alive somehow, like a guardian standing shoulder to shoulder with him. He heard engines down the hill, neighbors rushing home from town, preparing in their own ways. Lydia texted him, "Be safe, this one looks serious." He replied simply, "You too." By nightfall, the temperature plummeted to levels he had only felt overseas on high mountain patrols, the kind of cold that crept into lungs and slowed blood. Snowflakes began falling, soft at first, then faster, then sideways. And then the wind arrived. A single blast hit the ridge so hard that the cabin trembled. The windows rattled in their frames. The barn cabin outer walls absorbed most of the impact, humming like a drum. Shadow braced his paws and growled softly. The storm struck in full. Snow whipped across the mountain, erasing the world beyond the shelter walls. The wind howled like it had teeth, tearing through the trees, bending them until they groaned in protest. The air outside dropped to a deadly cold, far beyond anything a person could survive unprotected. Inside the cabin, Shadow paced, restless. He kept returning to the door, ears pinned back, then circling Caleb, anxious and alert. "What is it, boy?" Caleb asked, feeding another log into the stove. Shadow barked, short, sharp, and pressed his face against Caleb's thigh before running to the door again. It wasn't normal behavior. Even during storms, Shadow didn't panic. This was something deeper. Caleb turned off the lantern and listened. Over the roar of the wind, something else, faint, muffled, drifted through the double wall. A sound he knew too well, a human cry. Caleb stiffened. The sound vanished, swallowed instantly by the blizzard. He wasn't sure if he truly heard it, or if it came from the past, from memories clawing at the edges of the storm. Shadow howled, a long, urgent, bone-deep sound. "Shadow, wait!" The dog pushed the door with his nose, pawing at it, frantic. Caleb's breath quickened. His chest tightened. Flashbacks threatened at the edges of his vision. Dust, chaos, voices lost in the noise. But he moved anyway. He grabbed a rope, tied one end around his waist, and opened the inner barn cabin door just enough to let Shadow slip into the sheltered walkway. The outer door crashed against the storm as he cracked it open. A blast of cold slapped him hard enough to blur his vision. Snow swirled in a violent spiral, white, endless, suffocating. Shadow disappeared into it like a ghost. "Shadow! Shadow!" But the dog was gone, swallowed by the whiteout. Caleb's instincts screamed at him. The storm's force was staggering. Stepping beyond the barn cabin could mean losing all direction, freezing within minutes. But Shadow was out there. Shadow, who had pulled him from explosions, nightmares, collapsed roofs. Shadow, who had saved his life more times than Caleb could count. He yanked the rope taut, braced himself against the frame, and stepped into the white chaos. The storm roared in his ears. Snow stung his eyes. He leaned into the wind, 1 foot at a time, following the faint sound of barking carried by the storm. Then he tripped on something, someone. A shape half buried in snow. He brushed frost from the small, pale face. A child. A girl. Emma Thompson. Her lips blue, her tiny body shaking. A rope was tied around her waist, the other end trailing into the storm, cut or snapped. Shadow stood over her, fur whipping in the wind, barking desperately. "Good boy," Caleb whispered, voice cracking. He wrapped Emma in his coat, lifted her to his chest, and stumbled backward toward the glowing outline of the barn cabin. Each step felt like dragging stone through mud. The wind shoved him sideways. Snow blinded him. His fingers went numb. His breath turned shallow. But Shadow kept barking until they crossed the threshold. Caleb slammed the outer door shut, collapsing into the walkway with Emma in his arms. Shadow pressed against him, whining softly. Inside the cabin, the heat wrapped them like a blanket. Caleb placed Emma near the stove, rubbing her hands and arms, trying to coax warmth back into her limbs. Shadow curled beside her, lending her his body heat. She stirred faintly. "Cold," she whispered. "You're safe now," Caleb said softly. "Stay with me." He wrapped her tighter, heart pounding with adrenaline and fear. Another gust slammed into the outer walls. The ridge shook, and in that moment, Caleb understood. The storm had only just begun, and before it ended, the entire town may come knocking, whether they respected him or not. The barn cabin's first test had arrived, and it would not be its last. The storm only grew worse. Snow slammed against the double walls hard enough to shake loose frost from the rafters. The wind howled like something alive, swirling around Bitterroot Ridge until the world beyond the cabin felt erased, swallowed by white and fury. Inside, Emma Thompson lay wrapped in blankets near the stove. Her face, pale as winter moonlight, slowly pinked under the heavy warmth. Shadow lay pressed against her side, offering every bit of body heat he had. Caleb monitored her breathing, moving between the stove and the doorway with the anxious precision of a medic in a field tent. "Stay with me, kid," he whispered, rubbing her small hands. "You're tougher than this storm." Emma's lips trembled, but her eyes stayed closed. Shadow let out a soft huff, nudging Caleb's knee as if telling him, "She's still fighting." Hours passed like this. The fire needed feeding every 20 minutes. The room stayed warm, but the walkway shook with each wave of wind. Sometimes the sound of ice pellets hitting the outer walls rang like metal shrapnel. And then, a thud. Caleb stiffened. Shadow rose fast, ears forward, body tense. Another thud, muffled, desperate. A human knock. Caleb pulled on his coat and cracked open the inner walkway door. Instantly, snow blew in, swirling around his boots. He pushed through the double-door system he designed and stepped into the protected walkway, lantern in hand. Shadow stayed by his side, tail stiff, ready. The knock came again, weak, uneven. Caleb unlatched the outer door and pulled it open. Figures stumbled in, shadows at first, then faces, then full bodies collapsing under the sudden reprieve from the storm. The Garrett family. Sarah Garrett, the bright-eyed girl who had asked Caleb questions all summer, staggered in first. Her parents followed, dragging two younger brothers wrapped in frozen blankets. Their grandmother leaned on Sarah's shoulder, barely conscious. Caleb reached out, catching the old woman before she fell. "Get inside. Stay low." We ran out of wood," Sarah gasped, eyes watering from the freezing air. "The snow buried everything. Dad tried to dig, but it... Caleb didn't let her finish. "You made it. That's what matters." But behind her, visible only when he squinted into the churning white, came more shapes. The Hendersons, the Petersons, families he barely knew, faces reddened and raw from cold, teeth chattering violently, boots frozen stiff. One by one, they crossed the threshold into his barn cabin, collapsing into piles near the inner door as heat wrapped around them like a lifeline. Shadow wove between them, checking each newcomer with quick sniffs before pressing himself against whichever child lay coldest. The walkway that had once felt spacious now felt packed, crowded with bodies seeking warmth, breath, life. Caleb moved between them, guiding everyone inside with calm urgency. Keep moving, stay together, don't fall asleep yet. Sit by the stove, there's room for all of you. But then, another sound cut through the storm. This time, not a knock. A bang. Shadow's head shot toward the door. His bark thundered through the shelter, the deep, commanding bark he'd learned in war zones. Caleb pushed through the walkway again, heart pounding. He opened the outer door, and Earl Thompson stumbled in, his beard coated in ice, his eyes wild with panic. In his arms he carried Emma's mother, Margaret, her face bluish and slack. Behind him limped James, their 12-year-old son, clutching his side. Earl fell to his knees, snow exploding around him. "Please!" he choked. "Caleb, please! She's freezing! My wife! She won't wake up!" Caleb's breath caught. Earl Thompson, the man who mocked him, threatened him, tried to stop him, was crying. Not the angry tears of a prideful man, the broken tears of a father and husband facing the unthinkable. Shadow approached slowly, lowering his head. Earl didn't even flinch, didn't even seem to notice the dog. So focused was he on the limp woman in his arms. Caleb knelt. "Give her to me." Earl hesitated. "Hunter, Now, Earl." Earl lowered Margaret into Caleb's arms, hands trembling uncontrollably. Caleb carried her inside, laying her near the stove beside Emma. He covered her with every blanket he had left, rubbing her arms, checking her breathing. Shallow, but present. Shadow curled beside her feet. Earl staggered in after Caleb, removing his gloves to rub life back into his son's hands. James's fingers were stiff, but he forced a weak smile at Shadow. Caleb rose, breath ragged. He met Earl's eyes across the cramped room. For a long moment, the only sounds were the wind and the crackling stove. Then Earl spoke, voice breaking like thin ice. "I was wrong." Caleb didn't reply. Earl swallowed hard. "I mocked you. I mocked this place. I told the whole town you were crazy, that you were building a damned coffin." His gaze swept the room, 21 people now packed into Caleb's shelter, breathing, warming, surviving. But this saved us. Caleb looked at the families huddled together, at the children who were slowly waking, at Shadow, moving from person to person like a guardian making rounds. He spoke softly. "This place was built to save me and Shadow. I didn't expect it to save everyone else." Earl lowered his head. "Caleb, if Emma makes it, if my wife makes it," his voice cracked again, "I'll owe you more than I can ever repay." Caleb felt the weight of Earl's words, but he didn't let them settle too deeply. Not yet. Survival came first. Pride and apologies could come later. He knelt beside Emma once more. She stirred, lashes fluttering. Shadow licked her cheek gently, and she whispered a faint, "Hi, doggy." Relief washed through the cabin. Earl collapsed to the floor and covered his face with his hands. Outside, the storm raged on, louder than before. Snow piling feet deep, winds screaming like the ridge itself was splitting open. But inside Caleb's barn cabin, a different sound grew stronger. Life. Breathing. Whispering. Soft cries of relief. Shadow curled in the center of it all, lifting his head only when the storm hit the walls particularly hard, guarding them, protecting them, every muscle ready. The people who mocked Caleb were now sheltered by the very thing they tried to tear down. The night stretched long. The storm showed no signs of mercy. But inside the shelter, hope flickered warm and steady. They had survived the first wave, but morning had not yet come. The storm roared through the night like a living thing, angry, relentless, determined to tear apart anything that dared stand against it. The double walls of the barn cabin trembled under the pressure, but they held. The steep roof, designed to shed snow, sent avalanches sliding harmlessly down the sides. Every few hours, another muffled whoosh of snow sliding echoed through the walls, followed by the deep, reassuring stillness of the structure settling into its strength. Inside, the cramped refuge pulsed with fragile life. Families huddled in clusters, sharing blankets, sharing hope. Children leaned on one another, half asleep. Parents whispered prayers, gratitude, exhaustion. A few men took turns tending the fire, feeding it the dry wood Caleb had spent months cutting, curing, stacking. Shadow moved through the room like a quiet guardian, brushing against knees, sniffing hands, curling up beside anyone shivering too hard. His injured leg trembled sometimes, but he never stopped working, never stopped watching. Caleb didn't rest. He moved from group to group, checking for frostbite, pouring warm water, rationing food, keeping the fire alive, making sure no one drifted into the dangerous sleep that cold sometimes lured people into. Each time he passed the stove, he whispered to himself, "One more hour. Keep them alive 1 more hour." But somewhere past midnight, even the storm seemed to pause. Not stop, not weaken, just pause. A strange stillness pressed against the walls, heavy and unnatural, like the world holding its breath. Caleb stepped into the walkway, opened the second door a crack, and was greeted by absolute white. The snow had risen nearly to the roofline. Only the top foot of the outer door was still visible. The rest was buried, swallowed by the storm's fury. He shut the door and leaned against it. They wouldn't be leaving in the morning. They wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. By dawn, the storm's final tantrum rattled the walls with a deep groaning sound. Then slowly, the wind began to calm. Birds didn't sing. Nothing moved outside. The ridge felt dead. But silence, after so much chaos, was a kind of mercy. Families stirred awake. Children cried softly when they realized the wind was gone. Adults stumbled toward the walkway, and when Caleb opened the inner door, even he couldn't hide his shock. Snow stretched to the sky, not to the treetops, above them. Drifts reached 20 feet high in some places, sculpted by the wind into impossible frozen waves. Entire homes were invisible beneath it. Only chimneys, broken, bent, or frozen over, hinted where roofs once stood. The sun hit the snow like a blade, blinding in the morning light. One by one, the families stepped out into the barn walkway, staring through the narrow window Caleb had built into the upper wall. Not a single person spoke for nearly a minute. Earl Thompson broke the silence. "My God," he whispered, "if we hadn't come here." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Shadow pushed his head against Caleb's hand. Caleb scratched his ears gently. It took hours for the adults to dig a path out the sheltered side door. Caleb had designed the exit specifically for storms like this, angled, protected, oriented away from prevailing winds. And when they finally stepped outside, the truth hit them harder than the cold ever had. 80% of the houses on Bitterroot Ridge were destroyed. Walls bowed inward, roofs collapsed, barns flattened under the weight of the blizzard. Woodpiles vanished under mountains of snow, now soaked, frozen, unusable. Every home had been beaten except one, Caleb's. The barn cabin stood like a fortress, its sod walls solid, its roof untouched, its firewood perfectly dry and neatly stacked inside the insulated corridor. Shadow barked once, loud and proud, as if announcing the structure's victory. Families gathered around Caleb, forming a semicircle in the snow. Earl stepped forward first. There was no pride left in him, no bluster, no arrogance, only humility. "Hunter," his voice trembled, "I mocked you. I mocked this place. I mocked your service. I tried to shut down the only shelter that could have saved us." He looked down, drawing a shaky breath. "You saved my wife. You saved my children. You saved all of us. And I don't know how to repay that." Caleb looked at Earl, the man who had once been his loudest critic, and saw not an enemy, but a man changed by loss, survival, gratitude. "You repay it by learning," Caleb said quietly. "By building better. By never letting this happen again." Earl nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Then teach me. Teach us all." Lydia stepped forward next, eyes bright behind fogged glasses. "We'll help you document everything, every measurement, every angle, every principle. The whole town will rebuild stronger." Behind her, old Jack leaned on his stick and grinned through his snowy beard. "Told you this thing'd work, boy." Families murmured, nodding, gathering closer. A circle of renewed hope formed in the cold morning air. For the first time, Caleb didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like a builder, a protector, a man with purpose. Shadow nudged Caleb's leg again, this time with a soft, contented rumble. As if he already knew Caleb had crossed some invisible threshold. Children crowded around the dog, petting his fur, thanking him for saving them, for waking their parents, for guiding them through the storm. Someone whispered, almost reverently, "He's like a sentinel, a guardian of the ridge." And the name spread quietly, carried by grateful voices. The Sentinel of Bitterroot. Lydia lifted her notebook. "What should we call the design? The shelter itself?" Caleb hesitated, feeling emotion rise in his chest. Then Earl spoke softly, with a respect Caleb had never heard from him before. "Hunter Shelter. If anyone's earned the name, it's you." The words struck deeper than Earl could have known. Caleb placed a hand on Shadow's back, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to smile without guilt. A real smile, one that didn't hide behind scars or memories. The ridge hadn't been the place he came to die. It had been the place he came to live again. And as the families stood together, surrounded by the ruins of what had been and the promise of what would be rebuilt, the winter sun climbed slowly over the mountains, warm despite the cold, bright despite the devastation. A new beginning, a new legacy. And above it all, echoing through the crisp air like a quiet truth, they mocked the veteran and his dog until the day their lives depended on them. If you made it to the end of this story, I'd love to hear from you. Just drop a simple 1 in the comments to let me know you're here, or type 0 if this story moved you in any way. Your comments help this channel grow, and they help me bring you more stories of courage, loyalty, and survival. And if you want to follow Caleb and Shadow into the next chapter of this series, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We've got many more powerful stories coming, stories that remind us that even in the coldest storms, there's always light, there's always hope, and there's always a loyal dog standing guard beside a veteran who refuses to give up. See you in the next story.